So a really wonderful group of crops to grow in the spring and the fall are the brassicas. Brassica, they're also known as the cruciferous vegetables. The plant family is Brassicaceae, and that includes kale, cabbage, broccoli, also includes Brussels sprouts, which don't do too well around here, Chinese cabbage, all the different kinds of cabbages, and collard greens. There are other crops in the Brassica family like mustard and arugula, and they're all grown somewhat similar, but what I'm going to talk about today are going to be kale, cabbage, broccoli, and collard greens. So now I'm going to show you how we would transplant brassicas, like kale, cabbage, broccoli, collard greens in this case. And like I said, the ones that you saw in my garden that are planted out here, I transplanted a few weeks ago, but I had a moment, which I call my Jewish grandmother moment, which happens a lot, where I was like, oh no, I didn't plant enough, or oh no, I didn't cook enough. It's that little voice that really wants to have plenty to share with everybody. So I sowed some more. In mid to late March, I think is when I sowed these, and I forgot that I hadn't planted any collard greens, so I wanted to make sure to get collard greens in my garden too. So this is a flat where I sowed Alabama blue and green glazed collards, and these are some mustard greens too. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the process for taking a seedling out of a flat like this, and it's the same process if you get a big flat like this, or just a 6-pack, or even just an individual pot, and transplanting it out into the garden. So here are some baby collard greens. This is a variety called Alabama Blue and green glaze, and these are green wave mustards. And I'm going to take them out of this flat and transplant them here in this bed. And you want to make sure that you're really delicate with baby plants when you bring them out of their pot or cell tray here. So I just want to do a light squeeze, and this would apply to a big tray like this, or a 6-pack, or even an individual small pot if you're going to be getting your starts in those kinds of containers. And it's nice to find an appropriately sized stick, poke the bottom, kind of pushes them up. And then gently, gently remove the plant. So these guys, they were an afterthought. I have already sowed and then almost gotten ready to transplant my other brassicas, and I realized I hadn't sown any collard greens. So they're a little leggy. They're a little bit pot bound. You can see that the roots are kind of spiraling around. Not too bad. I think they'll do just fine. So I'm going to use my hori-hori here to space out the distance from the neighboring cabbage. And this is going to be about, I'd say that's about 10 inches. You could definitely space these more intensively if you have a more intensively managed kind of system. So I'm just going to loosen the soil with the hori-hori and make a nice little planting hole. And then place a little collard green in there and cover it up so that I don't see any of the potting mix. And I can actually, with this one, I'm going to bury the stem a little bit because it is a little leggy. It has a long stem, and they'll do just fine with their stem underground. They'll sort of just grow from here up and grow a nice, stronger stalk. So I'm going to do another one over here. I do a zigzag pattern in my rows. Don't just do a straight row down the middle or 2 rows that are parallel. That way I maximize the space between the plants. So this is actually a longer space. Here it's about the same as here. It's like an equilateral triangle, versus if I were to put the plant right here, it'd be a little tighter. So this one has 2, which was an accident, and I'm just going to, sorry, actually I could eat that. Just pull out the smaller ones so that they don't continue growing together and competing. And again, I'm just going to cover it up. And I want to cover around the plant, and then I do a gentle push to make sure that there's good contact between the soil and the little root ball. So I'm standing in a patch right now. These are some Chinese cabbages. some green cabbages. Behind me, you'll see the largest plants here are a really wonderful and robust variety of kale that I love called Madeline, and we'll have that written down in your resources associated with this video. There's purple cabbage way over there that you can see, some other varieties of green cabbage, and then here I've got broccoli. So I sowed seeds for all of these on the same day. And you can see they've grown to be different sizes just because they have different growth habits and different varieties are more or less robust given these conditions. But I sowed these seeds actually in mid-February, which is a little earlier than I have in the past. But as the climate changes and warm weather comes earlier, that seemed like worth a gamble for me. And so far, so good. They're doing pretty well out here. I transplanted these out in mid-March, so they've been in the ground for a few weeks. And once you transplant them out, then they have room to expand their root systems, and that's when they get much bigger, as you can see. So with the brassicas, you can direct seed them. Most people transplant them because they grow to be fairly large. These ones that I'm talking about, the cabbage, kale, collard greens, and broccoli. They need a significant amount of space around them. They grow to be fairly large. And all of the brassicas that I'm talking about today are fairly heavy feeders, with broccoli being the heaviest feeder. And what I mean by that is that broccoli, in order to grow and become a big, nice head or lots of side shoots, depending on the variety, and be really robust in that deep blue-green, they need a lot of nitrogen in the soil. So you'll notice with the broccoli that I've actually just done one row down the middle of this bed. And with all the others, I've done 2 rows. If I had more space, I might choose to space the cabbage in one single row down the bed as well. But the cabbage is not quite as heavy of a feeder, and I'm trying to utilize my space really efficiently. So I can still grow cabbages. They may be a little bit smaller, but I can still kind of pack them in a little bit. With broccoli, the plants get really large. They really spread out, as you'll see later in the season, and so they need more space. So when you're spacing plants, you need to take into account both how big the plant is going to get and how much nutrients that plant is going to need. So in the case of broccoli, they're going to be a really big plant, and they need to have a lot of room to spread out underground to get those nutrients. So as I said, you can direct seed. A lot of people of these particular kinds of brassicas, the one that's most commonly direct seeded is kale. So some folks will just sprinkle kale seeds in either broadcast or sow them in rows and then thin them out later. And a nice thing about that is you can eat the thinnings too. And so you have these beautiful little baby kales that you can saute or just eat raw, put in salad, whatever. And then you can, as the plants get bigger, you can thin them out so they have enough space to spread out and make, the big leaves and become that full, robust plant that we are so familiar with. The reason that I don't do that in the spring, sometimes I will do that in the fall, is because the ground is very cold outside in the spring. So if I had direct sown kale seeds out here in my garden when I sowed them in the flat, which was in February, they would have either not germinated at all because they would have just rotted in the ground because the ground was so cold and wet. Or they would have taken a really long time to germinate and grow. And I probably wouldn't have plants that were as large and robust as these plants by this time. So that's an advantage, especially in the spring, of sowing indoors or buying starts and using transplants, is you get a head start on growth. And one thing here in this region that's really an issue with growing spring brassicas are pests. So there are a lot of pests that come out as soon as the temperature warms up. I was imagining we might see some today, but we had a little cool snap the past couple of days, so they're not here. But cabbage whites or cabbage moths, they're actually a white-winged butterfly, lay their eggs on brassicas. They're a preferred host, and they hatch into these fat little green caterpillars that will just decimate brassicas. Another pest that you tend to deal with in this region and in a lot of regions with brassicas are flea beetles. And I can see actually some flea beetle damage on these Chinese cabbages. The flea beetles tend to prefer certain crops over others. So they really love arugula. They really love Chinese cabbage. They really love also plants in the Solanaceae family. So that includes eggplants. You have to do something about them with eggplants in this region. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in a little bit. Natalie has a lot of strategies and solutions. But what I found with brassicas and flea beetles is they will munch the leaves, and the way that flea beetles damage plants, they're very tiny. They're called flea beetles because they're very tiny like fleas and they jump. And they will make little tiny perforations, little like lacy small holes in the leaves of the plants. And what I find with them and my spring brassicas is if I've given the plants the what they need to grow and be robust and heal themselves from that damage, they'll kind of outgrow the pressure of the flea beetles. So I keep an eye on them. Right now these look fine. The new leaves are fine. It's kind of the older leaves that are more eaten by the flea beetles. And the flea beetles don't tend to like the regular green and purple cabbages and the kale. I don't see any flea beetle damage. So that's my response to that pest. With the cabbage whites or the cabbage moths with those little green caterpillars, I will come later on in the season once they sort of become more of an issue and pick them off by hand. I pick them and I put them in a little container and I feed them to my ducks. They're a preferred snack. The ducks get really excited about them. But if you don't have ducks or chickens to feed them to, then you can either squish them in your hands or you can put them in a container and then pour boiling water into that container, or just warm water with a few squeezes of soap, and that will kill the caterpillars. Another strategy that I may or may not employ, again, I'm just going to be watching how the plants do, watching how much pest pressure there is to cover them with a thin covering of Rime or Agribon. Those are both brand names, but basically row cover, thin row cover that's made to let enough sun in and let the moisture in, but to cover the plants and protect them from pests. And it also can be used in the fall to protect plants from cold. So right now, I'm just going to wait and see in terms of pests. I'm not seeing enough pest pressure to do anything other than continue to nourish these plants and give them what they need in terms of warmth, which I have not a lot of control over, but I would cover them if it got super, super cold, in terms of water and in terms of nutrition. And also in terms of space to spread out and freedom from competition. So I'm going to demonstrate a few techniques with these broccolis here that would be applicable for all of these crops, but just given the time, I'm going to show you on the broccolis, and just keep in mind that these same care techniques would apply to all of these brassicas. So the first thing I'm going to do is you might be able to see here, there's a lot of little baby weeds emerging. So there are weed seeds in the seed bank in this soil, and they're sprouting up because it's gotten warm and it's been rainy. And I watered a few times when there were long stretches without rain. And so the weed seeds are sprouting up and they're just tiny, tiny. And I actually want them to do that because at this stage, they're super easy to weed with the stirrup hoe or the scuffle hoe, which I'm going to show you how to do. And you might be surprised to see this like holistic garden with exposed soil like this. I don't grow plants in exposed soil like this, and we'll talk a lot about mulch throughout this course. But what I do in the early spring with brassicas is I transplant them out into a bed that's been prepared and is open and exposed like this. And I leave the soil exposed for usually a couple of weeks. One reason is to allow those seeds in the weed seed bank to germinate and sprout so that I can easily get rid of them. And another reason is that slugs really enjoy baby brassicas. So when these were much smaller, I transplanted them out, and we'll transplant some collard greens and they'll be about the size that these were when I transplanted them out. They were pretty low down to the ground and they were pretty tender. And if I had mounded up the amount of mulch that I generally use in order to help the soil retain moisture and also to inhibit weed growth, that would have been like this mountain of mulch, of moist mulch around this tiny little tender baby plant. And slugs really, really enjoy and like moist, covered, protected places. You'll find them, when you turn over a rock or when you're in the woods and you're digging around, sometimes you'll find slugs. And so if I were to mulch right away with these spring brassicas, I've done that in the past and I've lost all of them to slug damage. So I leave them exposed, I leave them open in the sun for a couple of weeks, both to protect them from slugs, because slugs don't want to climb, you know, you don't see slugs just kind of cruising along in very open areas because they'll dry out. And so that the weed seeds will germinate and I can mitigate, I can remove some of the weeds from the seed bank there, and I can have an easier time mulching over them later on because the seeds that are near the surface have already germinated and sprouted, and then I've scratched at the surface, like I'll show you in a second with the scuffle hoe. And so I've sort of eliminated the top layer of weed seeds in that soil. So I'm going to go grab the scuffle hoe. Scuffle hoe, stirrup hoe, hula hoe, there's a lot of names for this tool. And I'm going to stand over here so you can see. So this is a great tool in a lot of ways. And you hold it like you would hold a broom, like you're sweeping. And basically, you just slide it back and forth over here. I'll do it on this side so you can get a really good view. You slide it back and forth. Sometimes you hold it like a hoe, sometimes you hold it like a broom. You can kind of go back and forth. And you slide it back and forth, and you can see that it's just kind of scratching the surface of the soil. And as it's doing that, it's uprooting and slicing the roots of the little baby weeds that are in that soil. And you can see my posture while I'm using this tool is nice and upright. And I'm rocking back and forth. I'm using the whole motion and the weight of my whole body. So I'm rocking my hips back and forth. I'm standing upright. And I'm letting the tool do the work and letting the weight of my body do the work. You sometimes will see people take any kind of hoe, including the scuffle hoe, and kind of do this with it. And, you know, if you really need to get at something that's really, you know, tough to get out, then sometimes I'll do that a little bit, just in like an acute situation. But if you're going to be using this tool to weed, say, these 2 big long beds or any amount of space, you're really going to want to stay upright and use the weight of your body so that your low back and your upper back and your arms and your neck don't get tired and strained. So again, I'm just going to scratch the surface here around these plants. I'll do you next, Kales. We're just doing the broccolis for the people. And scratch and scratch. And a nice thing about this tool is you can get really close to the plants, but you do want to be careful because with just, if I'm off by an inch or half an inch, I'll just slice that broccoli plant right off, which would really be a sad thing because I've watched these plants grow from tiny seeds and they're doing so good, and I want to be able to tend them into maturity and to harvest some broccoli. So this variety of broccoli, just to mention as I'm weeding here, is called Piracicaba, which is actually a city in Brazil, and it was developed at a university there in Piracicaba. And I love this broccoli because it was developed, as you can imagine, coming from Brazil for heat tolerance, which a lot of broccolis are really not heat tolerant. And if you're growing broccoli in the Pacific Northwest or the California coast, which are places that Natalie and I have both farmed pretty extensively in the past, then that's no problem to have a cool weather loving broccoli because you have this long spell all through the winter really and the early spring of cool sort of temperate coastal weather. And if you live in another area that has that sort of like, you know, the spring doesn't get above like being in the 60s. It would be surprising to have a 70-degree day in the spring. Then you don't need to look for a heat-tolerant variety of broccoli so much. But for us here in southern Appalachia, our spring, and in a lot of mountainous regions actually, our spring will go from, you know, a high of in the 50s to 75 one day to the next. There's this erratic big swings. And so growing broccoli in the spring here is actually pretty tough. A lot of people don't even try to do it. But I really love broccoli, and so I make the effort. And another thing about the Piracicaba is that it's not a heading type of broccoli. So when you buy broccoli at the store, you're going to get, I'll do that much and then we'll move on to the next phase. When you buy broccoli at the store, you're going to get that one big fat head. It looks kind of like like one giant tree. And that's a heading variety of broccoli. And those are great for shipping, for storage. They're great to eat too, but you don't need to have that density and that sort of shelf life for broccoli when you're growing it in the garden, because you're not going to ship it and you're not going to store it. So this broccoli, and we'll revisit it later in the season, is a mostly side shooting broccoli, or a sprouting broccoli is what they call it. So it'll make a lot of little side shoots, so little tiny like florets that are about this big. We'll see. Hopefully they'll get bigger. But yeah, not bigger than, not quite like a broccolini or a broccoli rabe, a little bit bigger than that, and they have that like fatter stem, but they're not going to form a tight head in the same way that that commercial broccoli that you see mostly in the grocery stores will form. And another advantage of that looseness is that it's much easier to get in there and pick off caterpillars and any pests that are in there when it's a little bit more of an open habit. So the next thing I'm going to do here, so like I said, broccoli and all of the brassicas, but especially broccoli, is a pretty heavy feeder. It likes a lot of nitrogen. And I didn't have time to add any amendments to this soil when I was ready to plant them. It was like a window of the right weather, and I just wanted to get them out here. They were big enough. I didn't want them to stay in the flats for too long and get pot bound. So I just planted them out here. If I had time, I could have added amendments to the soil and mixed them in before I planted the broccoli. And that's a great thing to do. And then the little baby plants, when you first transplant them, will have all that rich, nutritious soil to grow in right away. This soil is not particularly poor. I've been gardening here for 7 years, and we've been, it was mulched all winter, and what did it have last year? I think it had beans. Yeah, it had beans last year. So they add some nitrogen to the soil. So it's not like super poor. If it had been super poor, I would have taken the time to add amendments before planting them. But since I didn't have the time and I knew they'd be okay, I decided to just transplant them out. And now what I'm going to do is side dress. So I have over here, let me put this down, in my wheelbarrow, some beautiful composted cow and goat manure from my barn. You can see it's nice and rich and dark. There's still some pretty whole intact goat poops in there, and that's fine. Goat poop is similar to llama poop and rabbit poop in that you can put it right on plants without danger of burning it. So other kinds of manures like cow manure and chicken manure especially, if you put fresh manure right on your garden, it can be so much nitrogen that's released really quickly that it can actually burn the plants and overwhelm them. But having a few little pebbles of goat poop in there is no problem. So I'm just going to basically give each plant a little side dress. So I'm just going to plop some down. That's kind of a clump I'm going to break up here. I'm going to plop some of this compost down so that each of them has a little boost. And since I know this soil is pretty rich already, it's a pretty healthy, well-amended soil, I'm just giving about a half of a shovelful per plant. But if you know that you're working with poorer soil, then you could give more. And if you have more to give, then you can give more. But yeah, we really we don't do a lot of off-farm inputs here. We're lucky to have resources like manure from our cow and goats. So we try to just really be efficient with the resources that we have. What I'm going to do now is just, after I've put the shovelful or half shovelful of whatever amendment, in this case composted manure, I'm just going to scratch it in with the scuffle hoe. This is not really like the official use of this tool, but I find it works really well for this kind of thing, and that way I don't have to go grab another kind of cultivator. I just use what I've got on hand. So some other things that you can side dress with if you don't have composted manure are just compost, whether that's homemade, kitchen compost that's well decomposed, or compost that you buy or trade for or something like that. You can also get, there are different kinds of organic fertilizers that you could sprinkle around the base. And the one that I've used the most is, there are two brands called Harmony and Symphony, and they're both basically dried semi-composted chicken manure. So they're super high in nitrogen and pretty readily available and relatively affordable. We'll talk about all different kinds of organic amendments in the fertilizer and amendment section, but just thinking about spring brassicas and top dressing or side dressing, that would be something to go for. Another thing you could use is cottonseed meal, there's soybean meal, there's a bunch of different things that you can buy. And then there are liquid amendments to liquid nitrogen fertilizers like fish emulsion. We'll talk a little bit more about each of those and when to use them and kind of the benefits and downfalls of each one. But the technique for any sort of dry amendment that you would add for side dressing is basically what I've just shown you here. So the next step, well, something to consider about weeding with the stirrup hoe or the scuffle hoe. Today is a pretty sunny day. And I don't think it's going to rain later on today. So the surface of the soil is pretty dry. So sometimes when you scuffle hoe or stirrup hoe to mitigate weeds, what I usually do is I wait to mulch on top of that area for a day or two, for a sunny day or two. So if I do that and then it rains right out, I try not to time it so that I'm scuffle hoeing right before a rain, because some of the weeds that you're uprooting will reroot, will stay alive and reroot if it rains or if you put mulch right on top of them and they remain in a moist situation. So the scuffle hoeing for weed mitigation is kind of a two-part process of actually using the tool to scratch the surface and uproot the weeds, and then letting the weeds desiccate near the surface of the soil with their roots exposed. So that's just something to consider. So I wouldn't in this moment add mulch right away. I would do it in a couple days, but I'm going to add some mulch just as a demonstration to show you what I mean and how I'm going to do that. So what I've got for mulch in my same magic wheelbarrow full of everything for demonstration purposes are some dry leaves. And I am lucky enough to get these from a man who does leaf blowing on big housing developments. And he has dump truck loads of dry leaves, and through a friend connection, actually someone who gives him massages, which is a nice connection, he's connected with our community, and it actually saves him money to come and dump his leaves at my place rather than bringing them to the mulch yard. So he benefits, I benefit. It's a win-win situation. Another way to get dry leaves is to go around and people will bag them and put them out on their curb, and you can just grab those bags of leaves and have them for mulch. And we'll talk about other kinds of mulch too. But with the dry leaves, what you want to do is just thickly layer them around the plant. You don't want to bury the plant. And you don't want to have them coming right up against the stem of the plant, because the moisture in the leaves can actually lead to fungal diseases and rot with the plant itself. So you leave kind of like a little donut around the base of the plant. But you want to make sure that you layer them, you're not just sprinkling them like this. You want to layer them so that sunlight doesn't hit the surface of the soil, because when sunlight hits the surface of the soil, then weed seeds can germinate and grow. So part of the reason that we mulch, as I said, is to suppress weed growth. And another reason that we mulch is to help the soil stay moist. So especially in dry areas or in situations like this where we don't have a drip system, we don't have a regular irrigation, we rely on the rain, we want to be able to hold moisture in the soil through sunny spells, through warm spells. And in places where you're, like in out west where you're going to be irrigating, mulching is still really useful because you'll actually cut down on the amount of irrigation water that you need to add.